Okay, Mr. Mayor, whenever you're ready.
Good morning. Welcome to the City Council budget meeting for Thursday, August the 6th. The first item on the agenda is the public comment. This is reserved for anybody who would like to comment. We do have one comment, and I'm going to go ahead and read that comment. My name is Catherine Bond. I am representing the Sugar Lakes Subdivisions HOA as Board of Trustees member and government liaison. I am here to address the 2021-2025 Capital Improvements Program drainage projects and request the addition of our previously approved project to improve drainage in Sugar Lakes. This work would include replacing the existing 24-inch storm sewer pipes with 48 and 54-inch concrete pipes. 3 years ago, Hurricane Harvey and other adverse weather events impacted directly with some of our Sugar Lake subdivisions residents' homes. Some homes came very close to having floodwaters enter them. The city undertook to identify and study areas in the city exposed to flooding. The consulting firms hired by the city recommend projects to improve drainage, one of which was DR 2013, Sugar Lakes, Horseshoe Lake, and Sluice Gate drainage, copy attached. After the addition of Greatwood and New Territory subdivision, council adjusted the original capital improvement program drainage in Sugar Lakes subdivision's previously approved drainage project was dropped. Sugar Lake subdivision HOA requests that DR 2013 be restored and included in the city's 2021-2025 CIP budget. And this is from Catherine Bond, 1103 Horseshoe Drive, Sugarland 77478. Thank you, Catherine. Thomas, any other public comments? Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to item number 2, budget. 2A, review of and discussion on the proposed fiscal year 2021 annual budget and 5-year capital improvement program 2021 through 2025, inclusive of all funds and forecasts. We have with us today Jennifer Brown, Director of Finance, and Rosita Bashoon, our budget manager. Jennifer, Rosita.
Good morning, Mayor. You're going to get to listen to me for a couple hours today, so happy Thursday. Welcome to our first virtual budget workshop. And this workshop will be set up similar to the workshops we have done in person. The overall objective here is to review the budget information, and if you have questions, please ask. I have staff keeping track of the questions. We will answer the ones that we can as we go. And if we can't get you an immediate answer, we will get it documented, and we will provide follow-up information similar to what we've done in the past. In fact, we shared we have 3 questions already that we shared information with you last night, and so we'll make sure that everyone gets copies of that information. And our overall goal here is to provide you the information that you need to make an informed decision. Next slide, please. So today's workshop is going to focus on the general fund. This is the primary operating fund for the city, and it accounts for all activity that isn't legally required to be accounted for separately. And so here you're going to see activity like our traditional government services, public safety, public works, parks, environmental and neighborhood services. And the primary funding sources here are property and sales tax. As you can see in the chart on the right, this fund is very heavily personnel driven, with almost 77% of the fiscal year 21 budget going for personnel, including salary and benefits. Next slide, please. And just to put into perspective, like the context of the general fund in comparison with the rest of the budget, in the whole budget that was filed, we had $245 million in revenues and $253 million in expenditures. The general fund makes up about between 36 and 38% of those two. The rest of the funds will make up the remaining 62 to 64%, and those will be covered in other workshops over the next 4 weeks. Next slide, please. All right, the general fund revenues total $97.6 million, and as I mentioned, property and sales tax make up the majority of the funding sources, and franchise taxes, mixed beverage user fees, and fines and forfeitures make up the remaining approximately 1/3. This year we do have CARES funding built in, and even with that money built in, it still only makes up about 1/3 of the total for this year. Next slide, please. On the expenditure side, the total is $98.87 million, and that includes a one-time expenditures and transfers to other funds, and those show up in the non-operating segment. As you can see, a large percentage of the general fund gets allocated to public safety at 43% of the total expenditures. Next slide, please. And putting our workforce into perspective, because we are a very heavily service provider organization, we're a lean organization among our peer cities. The line here on the chart represents the average FTE per 1,000 for the cities in this group. And, you know, given the fact that our city is a full service city, our FTEs per 1,000 includes our airport and our water utility staff. And if you notice, there are some cities listed here that don't provide those same services, such as Missouri City, or the Woodlands isn't even a city yet there, and they don't provide full services. So, but then on the other side, you have cities like Denton who have an electric utility, so their FTE per 1,000 are going to be higher. But overall, this chart shows that we are a very lean organization and not above the average for this group. Next slide, please. Overall, our guiding principles for managing the city's finances is, because this is a general fund, we are looking to maintain this fund. This is the one that really has the most visibility to residents. The services, from the services that we provide, to the property taxes that end up in the legislative discussions, and the voter approval rate is focused on the maintenance and operations, and that's where those funds go. So we talked a lot about resiliency in the last couple of years, and we've made good efforts in our resiliency measures, such as our change in how we budget for sales tax, and our shift in funding from to the operating budget to fund our Sugarland Way initiatives and our rehab work. We're always striving to become more resilient, but never at the expense of our principles of responsibility and conservative budgeting. And so we look to have our financial planning, they're ongoing. We're always working on our financial planning. It just never stops for both short and long-term impacts. And our overall goal is to be able to maintain our service levels that are expected by residents and achieve our financial stewardship goals, which would be reflected in our low residential tax burden and our lean organizational structure. And that is what has allowed us to manage this downturn. And we did that by reducing expenditures in order to tighten our belt and maintain that conservative nature until we knew what the impact was going to be. Next slide, please. And so as we're going into the fiscal year 21 budget, we spent a significant amount of time trying to determine what the potential impact COVID-19 would have on the city's finances. And so we took, back in March, began some immediate development of various scenarios tied to the pandemic and economic recovery shapes. We learned a lot about a V, U, and an L scenario, and even an M and a or W and a swoosh, and there's a ton of them out there. And so we narrowed it down to those V, U, and L, brought those forward. And overall, our goal here was to have some data-driven decision-making and to delay our key decision-making until we could better align the calendar of those decisions with the availability of data. Because we want to make us informed of decisions as we can. And so overall, while we're striving to become more resilient, we'd love to be the most resilient city and say that we can weather this event with no impacts, but it's not worth doing that at the expense of our other values. So there's a balancing act that we have going into that. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so first I want to look at the revenue impacts of COVID. And so as we started looking at the impacts on the city's finances, we looked at the revenues that could be impacted first. And at this point, for these revenue streams that we identified, and I won't read them, you can see them on the slide, but we identified about a $3 million revenue loss in the general fund. And this impact is understated based on that it's compared to budget, and that we have resiliency measures built into place already in the fiscal year 20 budget. For example, if you look at the sales tax, just the year-over-year decline in sales tax is projected at $4 million compared to the fiscal year 19 totals. We're looking overall at about $3 million in total in the general fund today. And that is just due to the fact of how we budget for sales tax. Next slide, please.
Say, Jennifer, before you go off that slide, how many months of FY20 does this $3 million hit cover? So that's not it's not a full year of COVID, right? It's
right.
Just some portion of FY20. How
right.
much FY20 are you assuming for that $3 million hit?
That's going to be 5 months out of 12. So we had 6 months of data prior to COVID impacting us, and then we received our April allocation, which reflects February sales. So it really didn't show the impacts. So really, it's May through September are the months that are impacted, and so it's not a full year. This is a 5-month impact that we're seeing here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So since we started making our estimates, we have received to date sales tax through July. We have $43.1 million in total, of which 75% goes to the general fund, and that's about $32.3 million to date. And so we're fortunate that we were in a very good position going into COVID, and our conservative budgeting, and that we were performing better than expected earlier in the year. And so that put us in a good position to be able to weather this downturn. And so for our remaining months, we're estimating a 50% decline compared to last year's actual in our retail and food and entertainment sectors. And that is because those two sectors make up about 61% of our total collections. And so, and those sectors are the ones most likely to be impacted. Next slide, please. And so to illustrate how we were estimating our performance is for the first 2 months of COVID, which were March and April. Those were reflected in our May and June allocations. There's a 2-month delay in our sales tax remittance from the state from when the sales actually occur. And we were estimating up to a 75% impact or decline compared to last year's revenue in both of those sectors. And we actually realized about a 15% decline in retail in May and about a 35% decline in June. So much better than the 75% impact. In food and entertainment, we realized about 47% decline in both of those months. In May, when things started to open back up, we had the 50% decline estimated for both sectors, and we realized an 11% and a 35 or 36% decline respectively. Next slide, please. And then, so on a monthly basis, you can see how the sales tax is tracking compared to budget. The light blue line shows our performance. This is our actual collections coming in higher than budget through April. And then starting in May, you can see we started to feel the impacts of COVID. And the white area was are the COVID actuals to date, and then the blue shaded area for August and September, those are our projections for August and September that reflect the 50% reduction in those two sectors. And we're keeping our fingers crossed that we'll continue to come in better than we have projected for those two sectors. But at this point, it's better to be a little more conservative and have the sectors better perform, just because we don't know what the virus is doing, and it's still very it's still a moving target at this point as to what's happening in the economy. Next slide, please. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, somebody else went. No, my question was of the sales tax that is collected online, are we getting that now? And what's the split between that and the stuff we get out of our brick and mortar?
We are getting, so there is a online portion, one online component of our sales tax that we do receive. It is not a large percentage of our allocation, but for those who have both brick and mortar and online components, we are not able to tell what is coming from which component. So say for Macy's or Target or Walmart, for those that have both a physical location in the city and an online component, we're not able to distinguish between the two.
So we don't really know whether the online spending that happened is how that's affected our sales tax, whether it's buffered it or not.
Right. At this point, it's hard to tell. We do see collections from some online-only retailers, so we know that we're getting it. But it's for those. The difficult part is for those that have both a physical location and online availability. But that's where we are not able to tell.
Follow up on Steve's earlier question. For like our FY20, do we, for sales tax purposes, in the fiscal year, is it the month that we actually receive the sales tax, or is it the month that it's allocated that we go by?
We go by, that's the same thing. And so the month that it's allocated by the state is the month that we receive it. And so when we reference, for example, July sales tax, that we actually received the payment in July from the state, but it reflects the actual sales that occurred in May.
Okay, okay, so basically, so when we talk about our sales tax for the fiscal year, it would include, so when we say the September sales tax, it's the September sales tax that was actually I guess, gotten that the consumers actually spent in September, which we don't find out about till November.
December.
Yeah, those
December.
will actually, yes, those will get accrued at year end, and so there's an audit entry that we make prior to year end that for the CAFR that will reflect those in the October, November collections, the net difference, and so we have that, we call that the gap adjustments, and it just impacts our fund balance, and so there's a difference between how we budget and how we recognize things during the year. We manage that on a cash basis versus an accrual basis, which is how we recognize that for our financial reporting purposes.
Okay, thanks. That's what I just wanted to make sure I was clear on that. Thank you.
When we reference, typically when we're referencing it, we are talking about then when we actually receive the funds. Any other questions?
Jennifer, one more question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Back to Councilmember Porter's original question. How about those that don't have a brick and mortar location within the city? How much of that sales tax flows through to us? Do you have that? Or can you get back to us with that?
We'll have to get back to you with that. We are monitoring that, and if we know that we have a retailer that is online, if they're over a certain threshold, we do get a report from the comptroller of those sales, and that's what we use to compile our sales tax analysis that we do monthly. We put out in the monthly financials, and so we can take a look and see if we can tell what, if we know that certain businesses are online only, they may or may not show up depending on the threshold or the level of revenue that they're collecting. But the state actually breaks out the single rate payer online sales tax as part of our payment, and it's not a lot of money, but it is showing up as part of our payment allocation. So we do know that we're getting some, but for those we can't tell who they're from.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. All right, so let's move on to the next slide then. All right, so we do have other revenues that are impacted by COVID, and so here we've outlined on the chart, I won't read everything, but each one is impacted in a different way. So our mixed beverages, taxes, EMS fees, and fines and forfeitures are each impacted in their own way, but based on lower levels of activities and limits on public gatherings. We were able to analyze those and build in our anticipated impacts of those revenues in our projections. Next slide, please. Building permits is another one where we initially anticipated seeing a decline in activity, but that has not materialized, as what we're seeing is that many homeowners took the opportunity to tackle some home improvement projects while they were spending a lot more time at home looking at those four walls that maybe need painting or remodeling. And so we saw actually an increase in, that's one area we did see an increase in our sales tax was in our home improvement supply stores, but we also saw an uptick in our remodeling permit activities. So we're actually projecting those revenues at budget for this year. And then for our park and rec revenues, we are seeing declines due to cancellation of events and programs such as our camp programs. Those are offset by decreases in expenditures, but the main impact we're seeing in park programs have been declines from facility rentals. Next slide, please. So this chart summarizes the overall comparison of fiscal year 20 revenues. So originally we have $94.7 million budget for revenues. Our worst case scenario, we were estimating $88.1 million. In our current projection now, we're projecting a total of $91.9 million, so we're looking at about $2.8 million lower than budgeted, with the majority of that coming from sales tax, which still has built in the projections for August and September at 50% of our activity levels for those two big sectors. The other areas where you're seeing the decreases, again, are charges for services and our fines and forfeitures, which would be our municipal court activity. All right, next slide, please. So next we'll look at the corrective actions that we took coming into this. And so recognizing that we were going to have a downturn in our revenues, not knowing how long this was going to take, in March, the city manager began taking actions to reduce expenditures in anticipation of those declines. And so we took immediate actions to reduce our expenditures accordingly. And one of those steps was a hiring freeze, and that was put into place. We also reduced operating budgets for the departments based on historical savings. We implemented a hold on new initiatives and programs, including some rehabilitation work that had not started, and some Sugar Land Way funded initiatives. We placed those on hold just to be conservative and not undertake any new initiatives until we knew that our finances were going to be stabilized. And so we also recognized that we had some savings in fixed costs that we were able to capture, and we put a freeze in place on non-essential external travel and training for employees. Next slide.
Jennifer, yeah, this is a good slide. There's an awful lot of vacant positions here, and I wonder if we're trying to cover that with overtime, or are we just not doing things that we would have done had we been fully staffed?
Right. So we do have currently, and this chart shows, we currently have about 76 positions vacant across the city, which is about a 9% vacancy rate, and about 64 of those positions are in the general fund. But you can see that based on where those positions are located, they are distributed pretty much across the city. Probably the biggest impact is going to be in the public works area, where we have a substantial number of vacancies, and that's where we have had some changes to our service levels, or we've had to make some changes to the way we're delivering services. If we've had to scale back some services, that would be probably the option there, more so than handling it with overtime. Now, on the public safety side, obviously those are minimum staffing and 24/7, and we have overtime built into their budget. And there are always vacancies in those areas. And so those vacancies levels that they have, they may be a little higher than what we normally see, but sometimes they're just due to the nature of their recruiting cycles, they can operate with a larger number of vacancies, I think, than what you would normally expect to see in another department. Does that answer your question, Councilmember?
So, my question had to do with the trade-off between vacancies and overtime. Or is this? I mean, we're not picking up too much overtime that we could avoid by just hiring somebody.
Right, and that, I would say, no, we're not picking up excess overtime. The departments, we do have a process to review the vacant positions and release them for a request to recruit process. And so if the position is something that is critical, where it is placing overly, overburdening the department to be able to meet their service levels. We do have a process in place to review those positions and cut those loose to fill those so that we can avoid excess overtime. And if it is impacting their service levels, or if it would impact service levels, we do have a process to allow them to go ahead and fill it.
Okay, thank
I just have a comment to make. So when looking at this, what concerns me is the level of vacancies for police and fire. And with these two departments, they are really overwhelmed right now. So I would, I'm concerned about that. So those would be the two that I think we would look at to open for hiring in those positions. That's just my feedback on that.
Yes, and let me clarify
Jennifer.
that the hiring freeze is not affecting public safety.
Okay.
Jennifer, Jennifer Brown, let Mike address that, please.
Oh, yes, sorry.
No, I would just say that the vacancies overall are not out of norm of what we typically have. What you're seeing is probably Public Works the most impacted. The police, dispatch, fire numbers, they're within norm. Those positions Jennifer previously said the lag time to hire those positions is significant. We have recently opened up some positions in Public Works, but the reality is it does come at the cost of something else. And for example, we just initiated a big right-of-way push. We had a number of vacancies there, so streets employees are moving over and assisting with that. So we're managing it the best we can to minimize any service disruptions. But the reality is when you have the scale of revenue loss that we've had, it comes at a cost, and we're trying to minimize that cost and manage it. To Councilmember Porter's point earlier, we're managing overtime as well. So this isn't at the expense of overtime. We're managing that within our budgets as well. So thank you, Mayor.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Mike. And yes, and I did want to clarify that the hiring freeze is not for public safety. It's for non-public safety positions only. So we do have a recruiting cycles for the public safety positions that they have to go through. And those are pretty much almost ongoing, but they do a cycle a couple times a year. Okay, next slide, please. So our projected year-end results for fiscal year 20, with our estimated revenue declines of 2.8 million, and we've identified expenditure reductions of 1.4 million. We have an estimated ending fund balance of around 25 million. That is about 1.4 million lower than originally budgeted. So we are utilizing some of our fund balance to help offset the revenue declines, and that is due to us ending fiscal year 19 better than anticipated. So we ended fiscal year 19 about 4 million over our policy requirement, and so those funds are helping us to mitigate the impacts from this revenue downturn. So as you can imagine, cutting the budget by, initially we thought up to $6 million impact, and to identify that much in budget cuts halfway through the year is very difficult, especially when 77% of your budget is personnel related. And so that has to be one of the areas where we implement those controls. All right, next slide, please. Are there any questions on fiscal year 20 on how we are going to end the year? Okay. So next we'll move on to fiscal year 21. And the first thing we needed to do for fiscal year 21 was identify the revenues that we were going to have available to work with. So with sales tax making up such a large part of our funding and being the most volatile revenue source, we built our fiscal year 21 revenue estimates based on a hybrid model. Since our financial management policy statements are based on, we have direction in the statements that builds our sales tax budget using recurring revenues as the budget for next year. Well, obviously, with the steep decline that we're having in this year's revenues, we don't want to be building our budget based on that. And so what we have is we're using the first 6 months of the fiscal year. We are using our actuals because we actually had good numbers in the first half of fiscal year 20. And so we've taken those actuals and we have built in a 30% decline from retail trade and a 50% decline in the food and entertainment sectors. And if you recall, those are the two biggest sectors. They account for 61% of our revenue. And then, so for the last 6 months of the year, we've built in the original fiscal year 20 budgeted amounts, which were the fiscal year 19 actual recurring numbers. And so that is our hybrid model that we built, and that's based on the U recovery scenario that estimates that we're going to see an impact or that we'll start to see recovery 6 months into the year or of March of 2021. And you'll see that threshold or that use model in our other revenue streams as well. Okay, next slide, please. So to illustrate what that looks like, over time our sales tax has been stable. So several years ago, as you can see in fiscal year 17, we had a drop off from 16 to 17 as our last sales tax incentive agreement ended. And we recognized at that point that we had revenues that we were collecting that was one-time in nature. And so we started actually, that's when we started budgeting for one-time sales, or we'd stopped budgeting for one-time sales tax and started only budgeting for the recurring sales tax revenue. And so the dark blue that you see in 18 and 19 and the 20 projections, that represents the one-time revenues that we've collected in each one of those years. And as you can see in 2020's budget and 21 budget, there are no one-time revenues in those figures. And you can see that both the 2020 projection, even with the one-time revenue, is under budget, and the 2021 budget is even lower than that. Next slide, please. And so sales tax overall is still a volatile revenue source, and those one-time remittances can vary from year to year. And so this chart, I think, just illustrates really well how much it can change from one year to the next. If you're down one year and then kind of back to normal the next, then it shows, as a gain. And it just, if you're just looking at it on a year-over-year basis, those percentage swings can be can show up pretty wild, especially if you have those one-time payments in there. But you can see here that even with coming in better than our initial projections were showing, we're still projecting to be down about 10% year over year for fiscal year 20 compared to what we had in fiscal year 19, because in fiscal year 19 we had those one-time payments, and so it's real hard to look at those and compare. So we try to really look only at the recurring revenues for budgeting purposes, because that really should be the revenue that we're seeing on a multi-year basis. All right, next slide, please. So then as we're looking at the other revenues in the budget, as I said, we built our estimates around the same modeling, assuming that the decline in activity that we're currently seeing would continue through the first half of the year. So those revenues include, as you see here, our fines and forfeitures, as we're not able to have any trials in person. We've also seen a reduction in violations. And then our mixed beverage taxes with the reduced restaurant capacity and closure of bars, we're seeing declines there. We're estimating those to continue through March of next year. Next slide, please. And then the same for licenses and permits and charges for services, including parks and rec fees in the facility rentals and in our EMS revenues. Now, a lot of the parks and rec revenues will show up in the summer, which is why we saw such a big decline this year because we've canceled our camps and a lot of those senior trips and things that would typically occur during the summer. You would not see that reflected in next year's budget just because of the timing of those, but if this should continue, you could probably see us adjusting that as we get into fiscal year 21. All right, next slide, please. So taking the previous figures that I showed you on the fiscal year 20 revenues, this kind of puts it on the same basis. You can see that our fiscal year 21 base revenue estimates are down even more than our current projections are for fiscal year 20. And that is just due to, as Councilmember Porter said, in fiscal year 20, we're only recognizing 5 months worth of impact on our revenues. And in fiscal year 21, we're estimating just off the bat, we're estimating a 6-month impact. And so we are going into this recognizing a lower starting point. And so with that, we recognized that we needed to do 2 things. One, we needed to trim expenditures to be able to fund to fit as much as we could within the base revenues. And then once we have reduced expenditures as much as we could, then we look to revenue streams or what we could boost in revenue streams to be able to balance the budget. So let's go to the next slide. And so let's look at the expenditure strategies that we implemented. So that was the first place we looked once we had a better idea of what the revenue streams we were going to have available. Then we looked at managing our expenditures first. And first we looked at, like I said, personnel is such a big portion of our budget. And so the annual merit pool is one of those, we want to recognize our employees, but recognizing this at the same time that this is not a normal year, and that recommending a 3% merit pool just doesn't make sense in this situation. So the budget includes a reduced merit pool of 1.5% for employee merit, and that would be implemented mid-year, probably in March, if the revenues are coming in and we see a turnaround in the economy, and that would be released no sooner than March of 2021. Do I see a question?
Yeah, Jennifer,
Sure.
would it be okay to go back to the previous slide for just a moment, please?
Certainly. On the table?
Yeah. Oh, well, the one that covers the reduction in fees for service and whatnot. How much of that is offset by a reduction in variable costs, and how much of that is just fixed costs that we have to incur regardless, like personnel, utilities and whatnot, electric and whatnot?
Right.
What percentage of the total costs for that department are we actually saving because of the reduced services like camps and stuff?
Right. So this year we do have, so in fiscal year 20, we do have savings from not having the camps. We do hire temporary employees to run those camps. And so we were able to avoid those costs this year. And so basically the camps pay for themselves, except for the administrative cost. And so we really didn't feel really much of a negative impact from that. Because we had not started that hiring process or made the reservations or booked the trips or events that we were going to be taking the kids on for this year. And so we were able to avoid costs on those. Going into fiscal year 21, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. Now, going into this, we are not, the initial revenue estimates were, okay, based on our current activity levels, what do we estimate the revenue levels will be? And then we look at the expenditure side and we decide where we need to reduce. And so that's what we're talking about in the next few slides. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I appreciate it. I guess things like municipal courts, those are almost, all the costs there are almost entirely fixed, I suppose.
They are entirely fixed, yes.
That's
so
a bigger
they're
impact.
still operating. So with the court, we have all of our court staff, they're contacting defendants. We've been running remote appearances. We've been contacting people, encouraging them to pay by mail, online. We still have customers coming in, so there are still costs associated with that.
Okay, thanks very much.
All right, so, go back one, please. Thank you. Okay, so another major initiative that where we have the funding built in, but at a reduced level, is for infrastructure rehab. And I'll have a few slides that will go into this in a little more detail. So we have funded infrastructure rehab with a 15% reduction, with the caveat that none of those funds would be released until March. And so we did this. We built the funds in so that should everything perform well, or as like we've been performing better than our original worst case estimates, and so if our revenues come in and either meet or exceed our budget, then we would be able to release those funds. However, if we should see impacts greater than what we've anticipated, we would withhold those funds and not release those. And so that is our control mechanism, is the employee merit and infrastructure rehab in total is over $3 million in funding. And so, that's a good rein in spending, and that would be at city manager's discretion, or his call to release those funds or not, based on performance.
Jennifer, this just a quick comment. In the past, what we've also done is if we have savings from CIP, then we have redeployed those funds into infrastructure rehab, repair and maintenance kind of things. The thing I can think of is when we did the sidewalk repair replacement due to the drought, same thing with the pavement. So there are funds that may be available to cover some of that.
Yes, potentially. And so, yes, we have used excess fund balance in the past, and I have a slide later that I'll be able to show you some of that one-time funding that we've utilized for rehab funding. But we're looking, the way this is built in now is it's built into the operating budget as a recurring expense. And so in this stage, we're looking at our recurring funding and trying to develop a structurally balanced budget. So the next place we looked is our departmental operating budgets. And so where we had already identified some historical savings, we carried those into fiscal year 21. We also included some targeted reductions, such as continuing a reduction or some restraint on employee travel and training or non-essential travel and training. We've also looked at some non-operating expenditure reductions, such as our transfers to the fleet replacement fund and our high-tech replacement fund, and we're reducing the contributions from the general fund to those replacement funds for fiscal year 21. Did I see a question?
Thank you, Jennifer. I know I've been bugging you about this since the first time I saw the budget. So let's say the worst happens and the second half of FY21 does not improve and we're level. Is this the first bullet point, reduce funding, the deferred implementation of the major initiatives? Is there enough savings in there to deal with a flat 12 months of FY21 rather than an uptick in the second half?
Those funding would be equal to around 3.3 million in funding if we withheld all of the employee merits and infrastructure rehab. That also includes the compensation plan adjustments, and so we could withstand more of an extended downturn if that were the case. So if we were to see an L scenario, but I do believe if that scenario were to play out, we would need to make additional reductions.
Would we have to dip a little bit more into the fund balance then, you suppose? And for instance, what is the difference? So this is about a $3 million savings in the worst case when we don't implement the employee merit or the infrastructure rehab. But what would the shortfall look like if we did have an L through the whole 12 months of FY21?
And off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact figure, but essentially it's about, I want to say it was a 25% reduction in sales tax revenue overall. But it gets ugly, to be honest with you. We would, there are other things we can do, like not doing any transfers to the fleet and high-tech funds, or there are other expenditures that we could withhold. We could like at the bottom of this slide here, I mentioned, we have some funding built in to offset the salaries. We always budget for salary savings. We have some additional salary savings built in that is of a more long-term nature. We would end up needing to then eliminate some vacant positions on a bigger scale. We already have kind of counted for some longer-term holding of those positions vacant. If we go into what we call the L scenario, that would be a more substantial action that we would need to take.
Okay, but we do have a plan. We do have a plan to meet that. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for indulging me.
It's not a fun one, but we do have a plan. All right, let's go on to the next slide. I think I kind of talked through the salary savings, but to talk about our personnel, we do have a championship workforce. I'm very proud of our employees, we have, because of that, we wanted to include a merit pool, although at reduced level, we are able to fund that, as well as phased implementation of our normal salary structure adjustments and our compensation study recommendations at a lower level. And those are really just the structure moves. We're only impacting the employees that fall below the minimums of the pay ranges. We've also have the good news is that we are not seeing any increases to our benefits costs. Our health plan has been performing very well this year, and there are no increases in our cost to the city or our employees for health benefits for 2021. And we're able to increase our reserve for claims in that fund to our goal of 20% of anticipated claims. And so we'll go into that a little bit more when we do our compensation and benefits workshop at the end of this month. But these savings carried forward into the general fund, as well as our TMRS rate, which is the city's required contributions for our 2-to-1 match on our Texas Municipal Retirement System. The plan has performed very well on an actuarial basis, and our percentage contribution for 2021 is being reduced compared to what we're currently paying. And so that also resulted in a little bit of savings to the operating budget. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so this chart really just illustrates our merit pool, and showing that other than fiscal year 11, this is the lowest merit pool that we've budgeted in over a decade. And in fiscal year 11, we strategically did not budget a merit pool. That was the year that we fully funded our retirement contributions when TMRS changed their actuarial analysis or their methods, and we fully funded the city's contributions just in 1 year. And that was a conscious decision to do that. And so this is really, it's in line with the CPI at 1.5%, but it's, these are strange times. And so it just seems to be the right level, the right balance on merit. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so a little bit more about rehab. So in the past, we, as the mayor said, we used to budget for our rehab within our capital projects. And the way we did that was we would set aside 10% of our sales taxes in the general fund for pay-as-you-go funding. And we would use those for the rehabilitation projects in the CIP. So we would collect the funds in the general fund and then transfer out to the CIP for rehab projects. What we recognized as getting into fiscal year 16-17, and we were using our sales tax incentive agreements to fund those projects. And so with those agreements ending, what we saw is that that put our rehab in a very vulnerable funding position because whenever we would see any kind of downturn in sales tax, that would be where it would get cut. And so if you think about where we're at today and going into fiscal year 21, if we were still operating under that funding plan, we would not be budgeting any rehab projects. In the current year, we would have had to stop the projects that were underway, and we would not be having pretty much any funding available in fiscal year 21 because of the funding. So we switched that to over into the general fund in fiscal year 18, and we put in place a 5-year plan on getting back up to where our funding levels were when we were utilizing sales tax. So let's go to the next slide. So our base funding level for fiscal year 21 was right at about $3 million in recurring funding for rehab. So the 15% reduction of that is around $400,000. Here you can see the various areas of the rehab and the proposed allocation for that. On the next slide, I'll show you the actual prioritization from the departments of how they're going to utilize those funds. But overall, we're still allocating almost $2.6 million for rehab in fiscal year 21. Okay, next slide, please. And so for the public works projects, their allocation is $2.18 million. And you can see this is their proposed allocation of those funds. But recognizing that none of these funds will be released for any of these projects until at least March. And so right off the bat, there will be an impact on our service levels. We're not going to be able to respond to requests for sidewalk repairs or pavement repairs just because we will not have the funds available. And so there will be, we'll have a longer queue for those that are already, like, I think they were already done with spending all their pavement money fairly early in the year. I think going probably around April or so, they were pretty much almost done with those rehab programs for the year. And so not having this funding available for some time, there will be some delays.
Jennifer, question.
Yes, sir.
That said, if there's a safety issue, for example, on a sidewalk, we're going to go ahead and take care of that.
I will defer to Rob to address that since it's his area.
Yeah, and the answer, and Rob can answer this as well, but yeah, we're not going to have life safety issues.
Right.
So we have city manager contingency funds if we need to use those. I'd also just want to say, what we've built here is a flexible and responsive budget. So, we have 7 months until March, and we have multiple months to receive information. So if the economy is coming around, if it's, as it has looked better than we projected, it doesn't mean that none of these funds would be utilized
Yeah,
till
you
March.
can float it up and down. Sure.
But it does mean that we will manage it, and that if we're seeing a comfort level, then we may be releasing some of them. If it's looking like there's not a comfort level, then they would all remain frozen.
Well, that's, Mike, I think that's the key is, it's set up as a flexible fund. To the extent that we see things that are better, we'll do more. To the extent that we see things, if they get worse, then we could do even less.
Yeah, and Mayor, I think what we would do is just through the monthly financial reports, we'd kind of communicate how we're managing that aspect of it so that it's very transparent, clear to the council.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Carol.
Thank you, Mayor. So the $625,000 for sidewalk and trail rehabilitation, how does that compare to the FY20 budget amount? Because I know in FY20 we had increased it or maybe even doubled it what we had over FY19. The reason I was asking, I was recently copied on an email to a resident, and it said that there's a 12 to 18 month delay right now in sidewalk and trail rehabilitation. And I guess part of that 12 to 18 months delay for any additional sidewalk work incorporates this 6 month delay into FY21.
Rob, do you want to address that?
You bet. So how this compares to last year's budget, this year's budget is about $250,000 less than last year. Last year we had received some one-time funding of $250,000, and so this year we didn't get the $250,000. So it's a delta there with respect to the one-time funding component.
Okay.
Go ahead, John.
And then with respect to the service levels, that is correct. It's 12 to 18 months currently. As we talked about withholding some of these funds, that depending on where you are on that list, it could grow from there. So it's just one of those expectations that we'll need to reset as we move forward.
And those are all prioritized as well, right, Rob? Those requests?
Yeah, they're prioritized mainly by when the date they're received at the end of the day. And so there again, we're looking at requests that residents have called in. Not necessarily the ones that we know of from an assessment standpoint, but rather the ones that residents have called in as they traverse the city.
Thanks, Rob.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide then. And we can look at the parks and facilities allocations. And this is their proposed prioritization for their funds. We'll be looking at the sports field lighting replacement, And then for facilities, looking at emergency health and safety issues and tackling some of the needs from the facility condition assessments. So the total funding is at $2.59 million for the fiscal year. All right, next slide, please. So then the next strategy is a reduction in the transfer from the general fund.
Jennifer,
Yes, sir.
just a quick question on the slide before, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The emergency and health safety issues, is that something that's been on in the past, or is it because of COVID? That's why it's there.
I may let Stacy address it if I'm not if I don't answer properly, but normally they use these funds to address anything that comes up. So if there's an issue that's identified that is a health and safety issue, they will use their rehab funds to address it. Not that there are any specific issues that have been identified at this point.
The only other reason I ask is because there could be CARES funding that we can possibly use. I just saw the health and safety, and COVID obviously comes to mind, right?
Yes.
And so I know we've got CARES money as well that we can possibly utilize for this type of stuff.
Yeah, and we do have a reserve of the CARES funding, and so we are receiving $6.5 million, which the majority of that is going to is a utilization is for reimbursement for public safety staff that's substantially dedicated toward responding to COVID. But another allowable use of that is for improvements for health and safety and for the protection of our employees. And so we do have a reserve within the fiscal year 21 budget for that. And so, yes, we are looking for some facility improvements from that. But this would be just the normal non-COVID types of issues.
Perfect. Thank you.
Jennifer, I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
With the rehab funding being lower, we should probably expect some additional issues with regard to the infrastructure. Typically, we have a fund that allows us to respond fairly quickly, say to a main break. What's the status of the fund that the funds that we normally set aside for emergency repairs? If we're thinking about reducing our proactive rehabilitation, is that going to stretch out the time frame to do repairs?
Now that main breaks would be a utility fund funded item, and so that would not be impacted by this. We do also have city manager contingency funds built into all of our main operating funds. And so we do have that flexibility if something comes up that's unexpected that we can address that. But as far as main repair, we have funds budgeted within the utility fund to address those. Any other questions? Okay, we'll go on to next slide. All right, so then go back. There we go. It's hard managing slides remotely. The fleet replacement fund, we recognize that we do have a pretty healthy fund balance in the fleet replacement fund, and so one of our strategies here is to reduce the transfer in fiscal year 21 to this fund. With that, we are managing this fund by not replacing as many vehicles as we would normally replace in a year. And so we had originally identified 46 vehicles that would be replaced in a normal year, and we have cut that down to 20. And with an emphasis on the public safety related vehicles and those that are just really need to be replaced. The remaining vehicles can have, they're able to have their useful life extended. Additionally, one of the revenue strategies, and you'll see this identified in just a moment, is that we've identified that there is enough fund balance available in the fleet replacement fund that if we needed to do an interfund loan to the general fund, that we could do that as well. And so that has been identified as a revenue strategy, and that we would bring that forward to City Council as a interfund loan resolution if we get to the point where we feel like that's something that we need to put in place. But we have that built into the budget to be able to have that flexibility. Okay, next slide.
I have a question.
Jennifer.
Yes.
So on the vehicles, the 46 vehicles, we identified 20 that we could replace. So what percentage of that are we talking about? Public Works or police or fire? What are we talking about? What's the majority of those vehicles that need to be replaced?
The ones that are being replaced are there on the chart. So 58% of those are public safety, 25%,
Okay.
27% are utilities and public works, and then the remaining 15% are general government, other departments.
Okay.
And so you can see that the majority of those are those frontline vehicles that are out there on the street every day. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so then on the other strategy with the replacement funds is the fleet replacement fund. This fund doesn't have as strong of a fund balance, and so we're recommending only a 50% reduction in this transfer. And in this fund, we also have revised our replacement list based on what really needs to be replaced. We had IT go back and look at, what items really needed to be replaced. Some of the key servers and communication equipment are, those real key pieces of equipment that need to be replaced are budgeted, and all the public safety items are fully funded in the reduced list. But we've been able to offset the reduction in transfers from that. And we can talk about these funds in a little, we wouldn't normally talk about these during the general fund presentation, but since the reduction in the transfers is one of the strategies, I wanted to at least put one slide in here, just so you can see that, what is the impacts of that reduction. And so we'll talk about these funds again on the 27th. When we talk about all the other funds. But if you have any other questions on this, we can get those addressed. Okay, let's go to the next slide then. So overall then, with those strategies, we're able to manage our expenditures to try to facilitate our departments maintaining our existing service levels as much as possible, recognizing that inevitably there will be impacts on service levels whenever we are restricting resources, either through holding positions vacant or reducing operating funding. And so, we have those strategies that I just outlined for you. And where we could, we try to make the majority of the decreases in non-departmental expenditures so that we would try to facilitate the budget implementation as smoothly as we could, recognizing that, while salary savings is kind of a non-departmental, it's the vacancies that occur in the operating budgets and out there in the departments that is impacting the service level. But we are able to achieve significant reductions by budgeting the higher level of salary savings and holding those positions vacant, and by reducing the transfers to the replacement funds.
Jennifer,
and then our secondary strategy of delaying the implementation of those key initiatives will be key as well.
Jennifer,
Sorry, did I hear a question?
Yeah, you did. Mike, I'll probably address it to you. Stuart asked, next year if revenues were to be, let's say we have an L shape, then that does bring into play the fact that we could have to reduce service levels. That would then bring that into play.
Sure, Mayor. If you'll recall, part of our strategy when we met in June was to create a budget that gave us the ability to go either way, if it's a V or if it's an L. So if this does turn into an L, obviously we'll be working over the next year to develop those strategies because we're squeezing everything that we could squeeze at this point. But then we'd have to put on the table complete services that we would need to discuss. Whether or not we still can provide those services.
And that's why I wanted to bring it up, so that everybody would be aware that we had that discussion. You know, it's programmed exactly the way we planned it. You know, it's been a little bit better probably than what it could have been, but, you know, we can't see into the future and we don't know. But that could come up at a later time, you know, depending on what we see as actuals.
Sure. And then on the flip side, if we end up in a V, we would see significant increase in revenues over what we're budgeting. So the council would have the ability to amend the budget and then, you know, increase rehab.
Reprogram those funds.
So we've kind of developed it to go both ways.
Right, good. Carol?
Follow up to the city manager's prior point about the emergency sidewalk repairs if there's a safety hazard. So does the city manager's contingency fund, did you say, is it a single fund, or did you say it's built into every different category?
Yeah, so I'll have Jennifer Brown address it specifically. And there is a city manager contingency fund that is a percentage of budget that is for contingency type items. Jennifer can speak to contingencies within departments within the utility fund.
Yes, so we budget one contingency in each operating fund. So the general fund has one. It's generally it's equal to about 0.5% of the operating budget. So I believe it's around 400,000 or so, and it is one-time funding. We generally reserve that for those unexpected things like a runoff election, or say we have like a environmental issue where we need to go in and do a cleanup, or say if there's a life safety issue in one of our facilities. Those would be the types of things that we would generally look to utilize those funds for. It's those things that you just can't foresee. So the utility fund has one, and the airport fund and solid waste fund has one as well. And so all of those are, we have a process where it does require the city manager approval to be able to utilize those funds. And so that's why we call it a city manager contingency, but it's not like in the city manager's budget.
Okay. Did we need to access city manager contingency funds for the FY20? Have we had to dip into those funds for this year?
Yes, we dip into those every year, but we keep track of those, and generally it's little things throughout the year. Anything over 50,000 we have to bring to city council for approval, but generally it's the 10 to 20,000 amounts that just gets a little things that may seem small, but to a department, could be devastating to their budget or cause them to go over budget.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so if there are no more questions, get my voice going again. We'll move on. So then once we identified the expenditure reductions, we'll go to the next slide. Then we looked at revenue strategies to meet our funding needs. And so for our revenue strategies, if you'll recall, sorry, my voice is just not behaving this morning. My throat. If you'll recall, we built the 5% increase in property taxes on the O&M side, and we're able to achieve this with a shift within the existing tax rate. And later this morning, I'll talk about our property taxes, but you'll see that within the current tax rate of 33.2, we are able to move from the debt to the operations and maintenance component to be able to achieve the 5% increase in revenue. And that does not impact the residential tax bill because we're just moving it from one side to the other. And so, that is a zero change to the tax bill in doing that. But the important thing on that was the control that was put in place on Senate Bill 2, that they wanted to limit growth in maintenance and operations expenditures. But we can do that and allocate that funding without having any impact on the tax bills. Did I see a question?
Yes, just specifically, it's not a question for any members of the media who might be tuned in. We are not raising taxes 5%.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And actually, we'll talk about taxes in about, well, at least within the next 40 minutes because we're scheduled to end at 9:30. So, but we will be talking more specifically about what the tax rate will be in the next section. So we also have the CARES Act funding that we talked about earlier. So we have the $6.5 million that was our allocation. We have Fort Bend County built in, and then we have our interfund loan from the fleet replacement fund that would be available. Okay,
Jennifer, question on the CARES funding.
Yes.
When will we have that in the bank?
That is a good question, and we'll let Jennifer May address that.
Sure. Good morning. We are still working with the county on all the documentation that we need to attach. So right now, just out of a conservative approach, we've budgeted to receive it in fiscal year 21, but we're going to work as hard as we can to get that earlier. But it'll be before the end of the year.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, next slide. All right, so to our additional strategies, we have our user fee study that is underway, and included in the budget, we've only built in the normal CPI increase, and we're wrapping up that study. The 1.5% CPI will help us realize about $76,000 in additional revenue, and as we wrap up that study, we'll review that with the Finance Audit Committee. If we decide to implement any of the larger increases that are recommended by the consultants, then there's potential for additional revenues. But the budget does not currently reflect those. It also does not reflect any new fees, which that would be covered in phase 2 of the study and was planned for completion in time for the fiscal year 22 budget. So next slide.
Jennifer, I have a question on that slide, please.
Yes, sir.
We have a philosophy that people pay for the services they consume. Mm-hmm. So my understanding is that if we need to raise a fee, it's because we're not fully recovering the cost of the service. We're not raising fees beyond what it would cost for the service to be provided, are we?
No. Then that's what the fee study is looking at, is it's looking at what is the cost to provide the service, and they're recommending the fee to fully recover the cost, and in some cases you want to subsidize those revenues from taxes. If there is a fee where there is a greater good, and that the user of the service is not the sole beneficiary, and so it's looking at things like that. And so that's the part that we're wrapping up right now, is just going through, and they've calculated the cost of the service and the estimated levels of the services being provided. And so we're going in and looking at, what is the recommendation and does it make sense? Yeah, we would not, there's just some fees where the cost of providing the service is way more than what we would ever charge. And so, there's using some common sense in that, we're not going to charge $400 to adopt a dog. I mean, nobody's going to pay that. That we would never raise our fee to that recommended level. So, but then again, we're not going to charge more than what it costs. All right, so let's go to
Jennifer,
the next slide.
Steve, to your point though, there are two components to some of those fees, and I'll use the surface water treatment plant as an example. There's an M&O component, but there's also a capital component. So many times when we look at increases to fees, it may not be because of an increase in the M&O side. It may be because we're under reserved on the capital side.
Yeah, I just didn't want anybody to take away the wrong impression from this fee study. We're not looking for ways to gouge anybody. It's only to try to recover the cost of what actually it cost us to deliver the services in most cases.
Right, M&O and capital. Yes, sir, that's correct.
And this is only for the general fund. This fee study is applicable only for the general fund. We have a separate utility rate model that we'll talk about in the utility fund section. Okay, let's go to the next slide then. To summarize, so we were able to take that 88.94 million in base revenues, and with these revenue strategies, add another 8.68 million in revenue. But you can see that a lot of this is one-time revenue. So like the CARES Act and the interfund transfer, you can only get those once. So those are not sustainable long-term strategies, but they will work for fiscal year 21. So those get us up to 97.62 million in revenue. Next slide, please. And so just to summarize, with that revenue level of 97.62 and our total expenditures of 98.87 million, that gives us an ending fund balance of 23.7 million. That is over our policy requirement, and it gives us a 28% operating reserve. So we do have a little additional cushion there. But that does not mean we have additional money available to spend. When I show you the general fund forecast, the 5-year forecast, that will make a little more sense. All right, so let's go and let's look at that forecast. We'll go to the next slide. Actually, go to the next one. All right, so our assumptions in the forecast are, we have our impacts of COVID. We're anticipating at this point the U scenario, which means that we will be returning to our more normal sales tax revenues by fiscal year 22. And so then after that, we're following our policy statement guidelines of growing sales tax by CPI and by 3% accordingly. So we basically just shifted everything out a year. With the disaster declaration, and the resolution that you all approved in July, we have the ability to go have the voter approval rate calculated at 8% for 2 years. And so we did have to assume property tax O&M growth at 5% in fiscal year 22 again, but we are able to do that within the level within the level tax rate. So it's not causing an increase. We have capacity within the debt service tax rate to be able to achieve this. And so it's all looked at, in the bigger picture. And then we get back to the normal policy direction of a 3.5% increase. We're going back to the Senate Bill 2 cap of the 3.5% growth in the out years. I see a question.
Yes, please. This is one of the notes that I had when I was reading the proposed budget. Why do we have, we did this last year and we're going to do it in 21. Why do we have so much room in the debt service tax rate that we can move money over to the M&O?
The way we did the debt service forecast is we didn't build in any revaluation. And so basically all the revaluation that comes in can go to the general fund. And so that's how we basically are able to do that. So whenever we get revaluation, we have budgeted like a flat revenue stream for the debt service fund to meet our existing debt needs, and our debt service is declining. And so what that does is that provides additional capacity both to issue debt If we have revaluation, then because we haven't built that into the forecast, then that provides additional capacity where we can shift that tax rate capacity to O&M.
Okay, so I know that houses are selling like, I don't know, pick your metaphor, but they're selling well.
Yeah.
But let's say that we do have this L shape, and not only do we not get an increase in valuations, but maybe we even get a little bit of a decrease like we had a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to squeeze us too tightly on the debt service rate?
It shouldn't, because we do have a pretty healthy fund balance over there that we can utilize as well. And so we're very conservative when we estimate that fund. We'll actually be talking about that fund next week in a little more detail.
Thanks.
So
Appreciate it.
that. Yeah. So our overall objective in the forecast is to maintain our service levels throughout the forecast, maintain our fund balance over policy, and a structurally balanced forecast. And so in returning our service levels to normal, our goal was to get our rehab funding back to normal. We're able to do that over a 2-year period, and to get our replacement fund contributions back to normal, and we're able to do that over a 3-year period. So having the 1.5% merit pool in fiscal year 21, we're able to get back toward a normal merit in 22. We built in a 2.5% personnel growth, and then we normally build in a 3%. So we're back to that in 23 through 25, and then we have our 1% growth in operating costs annually. Okay, next slide, please. So what the sales tax looks like is, you can see this is the general fund portion only. So we're projecting in fiscal year 20, the 36.3 million. In 21, that drops to 33.2. And then in fiscal year 22, you can see we're getting back up to a more normal level of 37.8, and then we're growing by CPI. And so we're getting back to our more normal levels in the out years of the forecast. Next slide, please. On the rehab, this is the slide I was talking about earlier, where when we were shifting away from funding in the pay-as-you-go CIP, the dark blue in fiscal year 19 and 20, that is the one-time funding that we allocated from either excess fund balance or through the Sugar Line Way funding from one-time funds that were available. And so that was the funding that we were able to supplement the allocations. But in fiscal year 20, where you see the big increase there, that is the additional funding that we allocated through the Sugar Land Way. Overall, when the green line there was our original fiscal year 18 funding plan to get us from the 1.4 million that we had allocated in fiscal year 18 to get us back up to around $3 million, which is what we were funding from pay-as-you-go. The plan was to do that over a 5-year period. With the Sugar Land Way funding that we were able to do that in fiscal year 20, we were able to actually hit that target. And so even with the reduction in 21 to the 2.6 million, we're still above where we would have been on that original plan. And then getting that funding replenished over the next 2 years, we will be getting back to our target by fiscal year 23. But to put this into perspective, again, had we continued to budget for rehab from sales tax, this 21 number would likely be 0 because we would not have the sales tax available. And so we would be in a very different situation than where we are now. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And so this is where you really see the true picture, because with the drawdown in fiscal year 20 and even in 21, where we're still utilizing some of the drawdown of fund balance to balance those. Once we start building those expenditures back in to get to normal, you can see the net income in each year is very, very close to zero. And by fiscal year 24, we are right at our 25% fund balance. And so adding anything additional in, expanding any kind of services or any additional personnel, none of that is built into this. And this is just really the forecast was based on just getting back to normal. Now, if we end up in an L scenario, this forecast looks very different. And so that's, we have to take a different approach to it. But this is the forecast that we were able to put together. And we'll caveat this with, I don't have a crystal ball. And the one thing I can tell you about this forecast is that it's not right, because it's based on a set of assumptions at a point in time. And as we get more information, it's going to change. But, you know, we had to build a plan, and we'll continue to update this and manage it. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so remaining dates, this is just key dates on the budget that are remaining. So we do have a workshop. We have a public hearing on the PID assessment scheduled, public hearing on the budget, and then we have our tax rate public hearing and final actions on the budget on the 15th. Next slide. And then we have 3 workshops still remaining to go over the rest of the budget in detail. Next week, we will be doing the general capital projects and debt service funds. So this will be our tax-backed projects, and we'll give you an overview of the GO bond projects that were approved by voters and our plan to attack those over the next 5 years. On the 20th, we'll talk about the enterprise funds and their CIP projects, and so that would be the water utility system, airport, solid waste. And then we'll wrap up on the 27th with everything else, including compensation and benefits. And so any funds that we haven't talked about, we'll cover there. All right, next slide, please. All right, so now we'll talk about property taxes. So no one likes paying property taxes, but they are extremely important in the state of Texas. We don't have an income tax. So property tax is the main source of revenue for local government in the state of Texas. It goes to support the general fund and the debt service funds, and it is one of the few revenue streams that we have as a city have control over. So it supports all the activities that we were just talking about, as well as our general CIP projects, including the projects that are funded from general obligation bonds. Next slide, please. This is an excerpt from the financial management policy statements on the direction on budgeting for property taxes. This was just approved by City Council in June. This includes the revisions that we made after Senate Bill 2 and the direction to the city manager on preparing a budget that recommends a tax rate equal to a 3.5% adjustment to the overall tax bill, with a goal of recognizing that an overall stable tax bill is the objective, looking for stability in the tax rate and predictability of bills, of tax bills, and that after a GO bond election, that the debt service rate would be adjusted based on the projected impact of the bonds. Obviously, that did not anticipate pandemic impacting finances, and so our recommendation this year will be just a little different than that. But that's what we have written into our policies. Can't build policies around global pandemics, unfortunately. So we do the best with a normal year. Let's go to the next slide. So, but with that financial guidance, we do have among cities our size or larger, we do carry the second lowest tax rate in the state. This is the 2019 rates of 33.2 cents. Next slide. We've also, over time, you can see that since 1993, as a city, we've implemented things like sales tax for property tax reduction and growing our economy, and we've been able to lower our tax rate over time, lowering our tax rate by about 17 cents since 1993. Next slide. And then in fiscal year 2008, we began, recognizing that when you lower your tax rate, you get to a point where you just can't lower it anymore. So we started utilizing the homestead exemption to help manage growth in residential tax bills. And since 2008, we have raised it from where it was at 1%. We are now at 12% and would remain at 12% for fiscal year 21. So what does that look like for the average residential home tax bill? Let's go to the next slide. As Councilmember Kamali said, yes, Tuesday, the money statement is, what is the impact on my tax bill? So essentially the green portion that you see starting from 2007 to 2020 is essentially that's the discount that residents are getting off of the nominal tax rate on their bills. And so where we have a 33-cent tax rate, you're getting a little more than 3 cents, about almost 4 cents off of the tax bill just from the homestead exemption. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this year is the first year we have had are implementing changes that were passed in the 86th legislature from our friendly bill, Senate Bill 2, or whatever the transparency, and I can't remember what they called it, but it essentially changed everything with how we manage the setting of local property tax rates. And so essentially, effective with the 2020 tax year, what we used to call the effective tax rate is now called the no new revenue tax rate. And the rollback tax rate is now called the voter approval tax rate. And where the rollback rate allowed for an 8% increase in maintenance and operations taxes with a petition process for the election to roll it back. Let's go to the next slide. The voter approval rate only allows for a 3.5% increase in the maintenance and operations tax revenue over the no new revenue rate, and it requires a mandatory election in November if you go over that rate, which in order to go on to be on the ballot in November, you have to approve your tax rate in August, 71 days prior to the election, which this year would be August 24th. So in essence, you back everything up about 4 to 6 weeks because you have to have your budget adopted before you can adopt your tax rate. So that is all what the new rules are, except in the case of if you have a disaster declaration, which council did enact for this year due to the pandemic, and then we are able to have our voter approval rate calculated in the method that's used for special taxing districts, which allows an 8% increase in the maintenance and operations tax revenue and foregoes the election. And so be exempt from the election requirements. And so that's more consistent with what we used to, the old rules, I would say. Next slide, please. So we received our certified tax rolls on July 27th, and we did receive those in 2 pieces. We have the value that it was approved by the appraisal district at $16.29 billion. And then we have a small percentage of $326 million that was still under review. And so those totaled with 100% of value gives us $16.61 billion in taxable value on our tax roll. $490 million of that is our participation in one of the 3 TERSs within the city. And so then the net to the city the net revenue that we would get to keep is based on $16.1 billion. For the value that's under review, the chief appraiser actually gave us a value to use that is approximately 91% of that value. And so what you'll see from here on out will be based on that reduced amount. Next slide, please. So comparing the certified roll to last year, overall it is a 2.8% increase in the net taxable value to the city after the TERS participation. We have a 1.2% increase in residential, 6.2% in commercial, and overall taxable value goes up 500 million or 3.1%. We did have a 58 million increase in values within the TERS, and so that netted out to a 442 million increase in the net value to the city. And so you see this is 16.09 billion compared to the 16.1, which was at 100%. All right, next slide, please. So breaking down that 442 million increase, where it's coming from. We have 117 million in new value to the tax roll, of which it's roughly 50-50. It's a little more on the residential side at 60.1 million, 57.4 million commercial. The remaining 350 million or so is revaluation, and you can see that that is very heavy on the commercial side. We had, I'll show you the revaluation percentage increases here in just a moment. So, and then we have our growth in the TERS, which is 16.8 million residential and 41.2 million commercial. So overall, we had 164 million increase in residential and a 280 million increase in commercial. Next slide, please. So over time, looking at how value comes onto the tax roll, you have times of strong development activity, and sometimes it's residential, sometimes it's commercial, and you can see that the activity's been slowing down, but has been fairly steady, and the same proved this year, with roughly 60 million in new residential and commercial, where it's not our highest year, it's not our lowest year for either type of construction. Next slide. We have a goal measure to have a 70-30 split of residential to commercial valuation. And so when we increased the homestead exemption last year to 12%, we were actually able to give the break on the residential side, and so we were able to actually adjust that split a little bit more, and so we are now at 32.6% commercial value and 67.4% residential. Next slide. So then looking at revaluation over time, there are, coming into last year, what we were seeing is that residential revaluation was outperforming commercial and had been for several years. And so the average residential revaluation is indicated there by the red line, with the average commercial indicated by the purple line. And you can see that this year the opposite is true. And even last year, the negative revaluation there is reflective of the increase to the homestead exemption. Pre-homestead exemption, it was around 1%. And so this year, if we'll go to the next slide, the value increase, so we have our total value increases. This is both new and residential, new and revaluation, excuse me, in the chart on the left. And so what we saw is that, our preliminary roll that we got back in April showed a much greater increase, and the process worked. Values were protested and they came down. And so where we were seeing residential our preliminary revaluation was 2.2%. That has now come in at 0.94%. Commercial was around 9% revaluation, and that got reduced down to 5.1. So overall, we're looking at about 2.4% revaluation. But every year we're going to hear those complaints about my values are increasing. Well, there's a process in place for that to be able to, to be handled through the appraisal district, and the values will always come down. And so the process is there, and it worked. Next slide, please.
Oh, Jennifer, I've got a quick question before you move on.
Yes,
So you talk about the residential increases, certified values was 0.94% and commercial was 5.1%. Now, back a few slides back, we're talking about the 2020 certified tax roll, and it has a 1.2% change in residential and a 6.2% change in commercial. Could you explain the difference between the two slides?
Sure. The first slide, that includes new value, and this slide is just revaluation. Okay. And so this is properties that are on, like, existing properties. So if you had a home last year and you have a home this year, on average, they grew less than 1% in value.
Thank you.
All right. Next slide. All right, so we have received our no new revenue and voter approval tax rates from the appraisal, from the tax assessor, right? And so this chart just illustrates the current tax rate, and the rate that would be required to fund the budget is 33.65 cents. Our no new revenue tax rate is 32.407. And so that 33.65 is 3.84% higher than the no new revenue tax rate. And I showed here what it would look like if we had, we did have her calculate it at the 8%. So our voter approval rate, the official voter approval rate, is 35.08. And if we had it calculated under the normal requirements for Senate Bill 2, would be at 33.831. So we would still be under that voter approval rate. But there was no way to know that going into this, because our voter approval rate is adjusted for sales tax for property tax reduction. And you don't know what that's going to do. And there was just too many unknowns going into this process. And so I will still say that we made the right call in asking for that to be calculated at the 8%. So let's go to the next slide, and we can look at the split on the tax roll. And so this is taking from our current tax rate at 33.2, showing you the shift. It's 0.6 cents that we would be shifting from debt service to maintenance and operations, and that is needed to fund the general fund operating budget. And then we had initially thought that we would need around 0.5 cents to fund the GO bond projects that are in the proposed CIP, and we're actually able to do that with 4.5 cents. And so the split would be 23.05 to maintenance and operations, and 13.345 to debt service, for the total of 33.65. All right. Next slide. Jennifer. So what does that do to the average tax bill?
Jennifer Hamesh got a question.
Oh, actually, you know what? It's covered on this slide. Don't worry about it.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I've highlighted.
My question is not covered on this slide.
Go ahead.
I have a question on the previous slide, please.
Yes, sir.
When you say that instead of 0.5 cent to deliver these critical drainage projects from our GO bond, now only requires 0.45 cents. Mm-hmm. Are you saying that the actual cost of those projects is less than 0.5 cent? Mm-hmm. Or are you saying that we only need 0.45 and whatever, some other money coming in from somewhere else to pay for? So does the 0.45 fully fund these critical drainage projects from the GO bond? Yeah, that's my question.
Yes, it does. So the 0.45 cents is what we need to generate the revenue to pay the debt service on those projects. And so our value actually, with the certified tax roll, it was a little better than what we had anticipated. And so that's all we need to be able to support those projects.
Steve, I think, and this is a question for Steve. Steve, are you asking if the 4.5 cents funds the entire 47 million in GO bonds?
No, sir. I'm asking. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't using general fund money to supplement a GO bond project, but that we were increasing the tax rate by a sufficient amount to fully cover the debt service for the projects that we're going to execute.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
We actually looked at whether we should recommend funding more of the GO bond projects and increasing the full 0.5 cent, but it wasn't enough to make a substantial difference. And so this fully funds the 12 million that are recommended in the CIP. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So this is the impact on the average residential tax bill. So the percentage increase in the tax rate is 1.36. And the items that are highlighted in the text that's blue, these are values that will show up on one of the tax notices that we have to publish. And so I wanted to highlight those so that you could see the relationship to those. And so then calculating out our average home value went up 1.08% from 374,856 to 378,923. Then taking off our 12% homestead, then that works out to an average tax bill of $1,122, which is a $27 increase from the prior year, which is a $225 a month, and less than 2.5% increase. All right, so next slide, please. So what are the next steps? So at the next workshop on the 13th, I'm going to place an item on the agenda for you to take the record vote on if you all are concur with the recommended tax rate of 0.3365. Then that would trigger the publication of the notice for the public hearing. The public hearing, I think we've already polled to have a meeting on September 8th at 5:30 p.m. for that public hearing. And the proposed rate that we're recommending is 3.84% higher than the no new revenue tax rate and is below the voter approval tax rate. The impact, again, is 2.46% or $27 a year on the average residential tax bill. Next slide, please. So in the notice of tax rates that gets published, so there's two things we have to publish this year. The first is the calculation of the no new revenue and voter approval rate, which I'm expecting a draft of that notice from the tax assessor today. They will publish that notice, and so that includes a summary of those. It's a 10-page worksheet to do those calculations. Very complicated, but so there is a summary that will get published. It includes the no new revenue tax rate, the voter approval rate, our general and debt service fund balances, unfortunately with no context of what's policy requirements or anything like that. It's just listing the numbers. Then there is a list of the current or fiscal year 21 debt payments that we have to make on our outstanding debt, and then how much of the tax levy we will use to pay debt service in 2020.
Hey, Jennifer.
Yes, sir.
Can I get you to pause for a second? We just had a power outage at City Hall.
Oh, okay.
Give me 1 second.
Sure.
Coming back online. Yeah. Jennifer, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, you're back online.
Okay, did you hear everything I said?
Hold on, we're not ready yet.
Okay. I guess I can't go back till you can take me back, so I'll just have to wait.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
I think that means we need a UPS in the city hall.
I thought we had one. We have a generator. I guess it doesn't protect against surges all the time. We're almost done too.
Mayor, you got visual on the days of the PowerPoints?
I've got visual on Jennifer's slides. Yes.
Okay, we'll keep rolling the cameras.
Yeah, that's what we need. Go ahead, Jennifer. Go ahead.
Okay, so Natalie, can you take me back?
There you go.
Okay, yeah. So this is the last slide that y'all were able to see. So these are just the next steps. We'll be on the next meeting, we'll bring forward an item for you to take a record vote on the proposed tax rate, and that will trigger the publication of the notice of the public hearing on the tax rate, which will be scheduled for September 8th at 5:30 p.m. Let's go to the next slide. And this is just a summary of the items that will be in the notice of the tax rate. Actually, Fort Bend County will be publishing this, and this is a summary of the no new revenue and voter approval tax rate calculations as certified by the tax assessor that we did receive this week, which would include the no new revenue tax rate, the voter approval tax rate, our unencumbered fund balances for the general fund and debt service fund, and a listing of our debt obligations and the amount of tax levy that we will use to pay that debt in 2021, the 2020 tax levy. Next slide. So after the record vote, then we will publish the notice of the public hearing on the tax increase, and that's the language that we have to use under the tax code. And so that would include the proposed tax rate of 33.65, the no new revenue tax rate, which is just as a reminder, 32407, and the voter approval tax rate, which is 3508. And then it will also include a table comparing residents in Sugar Land. And let's go to the next slide and I'll show you what that table looks like. This, and that's where I did on the tax bill impact. And so it's just last year and this year, taxable value after the homestead and the tax, and then which is one of the outcomes, no new revenue tax rate calculation.
Stuart, you have a question?
The first line, which is that the tax rate increase is 1.36%. It is not 2.45. Less than half
rate, yes.
For the record, for anybody who's tuned in.
Yes. Okay, and then that tax levy increase also property to the tax roll. And then after we've got public hearing on the budget, and it also references as this, and we'll get you published, but it references, and so that statement will show that the budget is raising tax revenue or 3.66 tax revenue, and that from new value to the tax roll. And so that will be published I think that we're looking at doing that, it would be on September 1st. Next slide. This is a summary of the next tax process. So we have received by the tax assessor. So we'll have the discussion and take the record vote next week. Then we'll publish, looking at August 26th to publish the no tax rate, which will be then on September 8th. And then you have to vote within a hearing. So we're to do that on the 15th of September. Okay, next slide. Questions?
Council members, any questions on the budget? Everybody good? Okay, we're going to move on to calculations. 3A, record for receipt the certified values for the Fort Bend County tax assessor to be used in calculating the no new revenue tax rate and the voter approval tax rate for the 2020 tax year. We've got Ms. Jennifer Reed.
So I've got, let me just give you a quick overview, and this is another one of those results from Senate Bill 2, is that, after 2 is required to submit certain certifications and calculations. So I do have those signed certifications. The excess debt collection that were collected on our vehicle tax is for the collection rate for 2020. Certification from the tax assessor and new property of all appraised value of all properties and the taxable value of all properties, as well as the tax rates. And so I've received all of those. They are requesting that we record into the minutes of our next meeting receipt of those calculations. And that's where I think the mayor's got that statement. So that those, and I'm assuming you have to vote to accept those.
Item number 3. 3A, truth in taxation calculations. The tax assessor has requested that we record receipt of this information into the minutes of a meeting of the City Council. The actions requested in this item are to record receipt of the following from the Fort Bend County tax assessor as required by the tax code for the tax year 2020. Excess debt collections, historical and estimated collection rates, taxable value of new property, total appraised value of all properties, taxable value of all properties, no new revenue tax rate, voter approval tax rate. The tax assessor collector has submitted all of these items to the City of Sugar Land as required by the tax code as amended by Senate Bill 2. Jennifer, any other action?
That is copies of those to the city secretary as well.
Perfect. Motion to adjourn by McCutcheon, second. Ramesh, Jennifer, somebody? Jennifer, there we go. There we go. You got Lane and McCutcheon. I know we're all in favor. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
At least it wasn't us. I didn't do it.